Nobody told him it would feel like this. That's the thing they don't put in the training manuals. They tell you about posture. They tell you about the exact angle of your chin, about where your eyes should rest. Not on anything, but past everything, like you're looking at a wall that exists somewhere behind the visible world. They tell you about the bare skin and the heat it holds in July, about the way your knees will ache before you've earned the right to call it aching. They tell you a lot of things. They don't tell you about the weight. Not the weight of the uniform, though God knows that's real enough. Not the weight of the rifle, though after 4 hours that becomes its own kind of conversation between your shoulder and your spine. I mean the other weight, the one that starts somewhere around your sternum and spreads outward, slow, like something soaking through cloth. The one that only happens in one place at one particular post on the east corridor side of the palace, the stretch of stone floor and gilded wall that runs alongside the throne room. I noticed on my third rotation. Before that, I've been posted at the gate at the garden entrance, twice at the inner courtyard. Normal assignments. You stand, you breathe, you count the seconds without counting the seconds, which is a skill nobody explains, but everyone eventually learns. The gate postings were fine. Loud in tourist season. There's always someone trying to get a photograph that requires them to stand approximately 6 inches from your left boot, but manageable. You learn to be furniture. Expensive, breathing furniture that could drop you if you moved wrong, but furniture nonetheless. The throne room corridor was different. My sergeant, a man named Holloway, who had the face of someone who had given up being surprised by things somewhere around 1987, briefed me on it the morning of my third rotation like it was nothing, like it was any other assignment. East Corridor, Marlow, 8 to 12. Usual protocol. That was it. That was the whole briefing. I didn't ask questions because you don't ask questions, not in that first year when you're still trying to convince everyone, including yourself, that you belong there. So I took my post at 7:52, 8 minutes early, because being early is the only kind of punctuality that counts in that building, and I stood where I was supposed to stand, and I waited for 8 hours to start. It started like any other posting. The corridor was empty at that hour. It usually is. The public tours don't reach that wing until 8:30 at the earliest, and even then, it's curated, guided. People in small groups with lanyards, and a woman named Patricia who does the tours in a voice like she's reading from a very tasteful encyclopedia. They come through, they look at the ceiling, they look at the door to the throne room, they take photographs they will look at once, and then forget, and they leave. But before Patricia and her lanyards, before the tourists, before all of that, it was just me and the corridor. And the corridor, I noticed, had a particular quality of silence that I hadn't encountered anywhere else in the building. Not the silence of emptiness. I knew that silence, had learned to live inside it at the gate postings. This was something different, denser, like the air itself had been standing there longer than I had, and it knew things I didn't, and it had decided not to share them. I shifted my weight, barely, just a millimeter, the way you do when you think nobody is watching, and the sound my boot made on the stone floor seemed to travel further than it should have, seemed to take longer to fade. I told myself I was imagining it. The first tour group came through at 9:17. Patricia, I learned her name by then, had heard it from other guards in the way you learn things in that building, through osmosis and corridor gossip, and the 15-minute window between shifts. Patricia brought in 11 people that morning. I counted without moving my eyes. It's a skill. You learn to register everything in your peripheral vision until your peripheral vision is basically your entire vision, and your central vision is just the fixed point somewhere past the wall that the manuals talk about. 11 people. A mix, 3 older couples, 2 younger women who were clearly friends and kept leaning toward each other and whispering, a man in a blue anorak who had the specific energy of someone who had done a great deal of research before arriving and was now quietly fact-checking Patricia against his internal database, and a small boy, maybe 7, maybe 8, who was holding his mother's hand with the grip of someone who has been told very firmly not to touch anything. I noticed the boy because he noticed me first. Children always do, and it used to unsettle me before I understood it. Adults look at you and look away, which is the social contract. You are a monument. You are furniture. You don't require the same acknowledgement as a person. But children haven't learned the contract yet. They look at you like you're a problem they're trying to solve. Like your existence raises questions they haven't figured out how to phrase. This boy looked at me for a long time. Then, he looked at the door to the throne room. Then, he looked back at me. He said something to his mother. I couldn't hear it. Patricia was talking about the coronation chair or possibly the chandeliers. There's a lot of information being delivered in that encyclopedia voice. And his mother looked at the door too, briefly, and then looked away the way adults do when something feels like it should be significant, but they can't work out why. The boy kept looking at the door. I understood him. I didn't let it show on my face. Nothing shows on my face on posting. I've gotten very good at that. But I understood him because I've been doing the same thing since 752. There's something about that door. It's not remarkable architecturally. I know that sounds almost offensive, standing in Buckingham Palace and calling a door unremarkable, but it's true. There are more ornate doors in that building, more heavily gilded, more aggressively imposing. The throne room door is tall, certainly, and the detail work is fine, and the brass fittings are the kind of brass that's been polished so many times over so many decades that it's given up having a reflection and just glows instead. It's a distinguished door, but it's not the most distinguished door. It's what the door holds. That's the thing you feel standing in that corridor. Not the door itself, not the room behind it. You can't see the room. Obviously, the door is closed, has been closed every time I've stood that posting, but the accumulated weight of everything the room has meant. Every person who stood before that throne and felt the full machinery of history pressing down on their shoulders. Every moment of ceremony that happened inside those walls, witnessed by people who have been dead for 100 years, 150, 200. Time moves differently near a place like that. I know how that sounds. I'm not the type to say things like that. I'm from Coventry. My father drove a delivery van. I studied 2 years at university, dropped out, joined up, and here I am, not the kind of person who speaks in abstractions about the nature of time. But I'm trying to be accurate, and accuracy requires saying, standing in that corridor, 8 hours at a stretch, there are moments when the normal progression of seconds stops feeling like a progression. Stops feeling like water moving forward and starts feeling like water that has found a very deep, very still pool and is simply being there, accumulating, not going anywhere. Heavy. That's the word. Time in that corridor is heavy. The second tour group was larger. 19 people, Patricia again, same encyclopedia voice, though I noticed she altered her phrasing slightly when she reached the throne room door. A small adjustment in cadence, a half-beat of genuine pause before she resumed the facts. She'd been doing tours long enough that the pause had probably become automatic. But it was there. Even Patricia, in her lanyard and her practice delivery, felt it, had learned to mark it. That half-beat was the most honest thing I heard all morning. After the second group left, there was a gap of about 40 minutes before the third. These gaps are, paradoxically, the hardest parts of the posting. When people are moving through, there's something to peripherally track, something to keep the alertness calibrated. The gaps are just you and the corridor and the door and that specific quality of silence. I was in one of those gaps, maybe 20 minutes in, when I first became conscious that I was listening for something. I don't know when it started exactly. It wasn't a decision. It wasn't a thought I completed. It was more like noticing mid-sentence that I'd been speaking for some time already. I was listening to the corridor with more attention than standard protocol requires, with a kind of tuned-in focus that wasn't about security, wasn't about identifying threats or anomalies. I was listening the way you listen when you're in a house you don't know well, at night, and you hear something that might be the pipes or might not be. Nothing happened. The corridor stayed empty. The door stayed closed. The silence stayed the specific weight. It always was in that wing. But I didn't stop listening. At 11:43, 17 minutes before my relief was due, a man came through the corridor alone. No lanyard, no Patricia, no tour group. He was perhaps 60, perhaps more, the kind of age that's hard to place precisely because people wear it differently, in a dark suit that was well-made without being ostentatious. He walked at a measured pace, not a tourist pace, not the slightly too casual pace of someone pretending not to be lost. He walked like someone who had walked this corridor before. He stopped near the door. Not at the door. Not trying the handle, not reading a plaque, not doing anything that would require intervention. He just stopped at a respectful distance from the entrance and stood there. He looked at the door for a long time. I maintained my post. This wasn't unusual. Authorized individuals move through restricted wings regularly, and a well-dressed man standing quietly in a corridor does not constitute an incident. But I watched him with that same listening quality I'd been carrying all morning, and I noticed something that I have thought about since, and that I still don't have a clean explanation for. He aged while he stood there. I know what that sounds like, but it's the closest accurate description I can find. He stood at that distance from the throne room door for perhaps 2 minutes, and in those 2 minutes something in his posture shifted, not collapsed, not deteriorated, but deepened. Like he set down something he'd been carrying at a height and let it rest at its natural weight. Like the pretense of lightness that most people maintain most of the time, the performance of going about your life unburdened, fell away, and what was underneath was older. The room did that to him, or he let the room do that, which might be the same thing. He stood there for exactly the time he needed to stand there, and then he straightened. The same slight readjustment, the pretense resumed, and he continued down the corridor without looking at me, without looking back at the door, and he turned the corner at the end and was gone. I stood in the silence he left behind. 11:58. My relief, a private named Okafor who always arrived 2 minutes early, would be at the far end of the corridor in approximately 4 minutes. I had 4 minutes. I spent them looking at the door, not listening anymore. Not the same thing. This was different. This was looking at something and understanding without language, without interior monologue that I could have reported afterward, that you can spend your whole life in service to something and only rarely, in the specific silence of specific places, catch a glimpse of what it actually is, what it weighs, what it has cost and continues to cost and will cost beyond any individual lifetime, yours included. Okafor arrived at 12 o'clock on the dot. Anything to report? He asked in the standard way. Quiet morning, I said in the standard way. He took his post. I walked back down the corridor toward the staff exit, and the door stayed closed behind me, and whatever the door held, it held without any help from me, which is how it had been holding things for considerably longer than I'd been alive to notice. The fourth rotation, I started keeping track. Not officially, not in any format that would survive a locker inspection or make it into a debrief. Just a small notebook, the kind with a black cover that cost 90 pence at any newsagent, which I kept in the inside pocket of my civvy jacket and only ever touched outside the building. I'm not entirely sure why I started writing things down. Impulse, maybe, or the feeling, which was growing with each posting, that I was in the middle of something I didn't have the vocabulary for yet, and that vocabulary might come easier if I started collecting observations the way you collect evidence, without knowing what you're building a case for. The first entry, dated a Tuesday in mid-October, reads, "The cold in this corridor is different from the cold in other parts of the building. Same temperature on the thermometer, probably. Different on the skin, like the difference between new cold and old cold. Cold that has been here since before the radiators existed. I'm aware that's not a precise observation. I'm a guard, not a poet. But precision was what I was after, and that was the most precise language I had at the time. The second entry, same week, time to today. The silence after a tour group leaves takes 11 seconds longer to restore itself in this corridor than in the inner courtyard. I timed it 3 times. 11 seconds consistently. No explanation. Noting it. The third entry is just 2 words. He's back. The man in the well-made suit came through again on my 4th rotation and again on my 5th. Always alone, always authorized. I confirmed that much obliquely in the way you confirm things in that environment, which is to say I mentioned to Holloway casually that I'd seen the same civilian twice in the East Corridor and wanted to make sure I understood the authorization categories. Holloway had given me the look he reserved for questions that were technically legitimate, but vaguely irritating. Parliamentary liaison, Holloway said. Advisory capacity. Comes through maybe once a fortnight. Nothing to flag. Parliamentary liaison. Advisory capacity. Words that meant, he belongs here, stop thinking about him. I stopped thinking about him in the official sense. In the other sense, in the notebook sense, I kept thinking about him. He had a ritual. That was the word I settled on after observing it 3 times. Not a habit, not a routine. Those words imply something maintained through repetition without much consciousness behind it. Un rituel implique intention. Presence. He stopped at the same distance from the door each time. I paced it out once when the corridor was empty, 17 feet, and he stood there for a duration I estimated at 90 seconds to 2 minutes. And he looked at the door with an expression I struggled to describe and eventually wrote down as, not grief exactly, not reverence exactly. The expression of someone doing arithmetic they've done many times and never quite liked the answer to. I wrote that at home 2 days after the 5th rotation and read it back and decided it was the most accurate thing in the notebook. He was calculating something, or recalibrating, some internal accounting that required the physical presence of that door, that corridor, that room behind it. On my 6th posting to the East Corridor, I found out his name. I found it out by accident, or by the mild workplace telepathy that operates in closed-quarters professional environments where you spend long shifts standing next to the same small group of people. You absorb information without quite receiving it. One of the civilian administrative staff, a woman named Ranjit who managed access log for the East Wing and was frequently in the corridor at transition times, mentioned him by name while she was on the phone 12 feet from my post. Mr. Cavendish is confirmed for Thursday, she said, to whoever was on the other end of the phone. Same window, as usual. Mr. Cavendish. I wrote it down. Then I looked at it and thought about what I was doing a Royal Guard, keeping a notebook with the name of a parliamentary liaison, and decided that the notebook was for me, not for anything else, and that noticing things was not the same as doing anything with them, and I kept writing. The thing about that corridor that I haven't been able to explain to myself or to anyone else is the way it affects the body. The body, which usually does what bodies do, calibrates, adjusts, normalizes, does not entirely normalize in the throne room corridor. I noticed this around my 6th or 7th rotation, when I had enough data points to say confidently that it wasn't a bad night's sleep or low blood sugar or any of the ordinary physiological excuses. It was the corridor. Your spine, specifically. I don't mean pain. I mean something more like awareness, a heightened sense of vertical alignment, of where your weight sits relative to your skeleton, of the relationship between your head and the base of your skull and the floor. Like the corridor was reminding your body that it was a body, that it was made of the same impermanent material as everything else, regardless of what it was wearing or how straight it stood. The bearskin makes it worse or better, depending on how you think about it. The bearskin is its own category of weight, not just physical, though it's heavier than you'd believe from looking at it. And wearing it in the East Corridor gives you the specific sensation of being doubly reminded of your own temporariness. The uniform is older than you are. The corridor is older than the uniform. The room behind the door is older than the corridor, or at least older in the sense that matters, which is the sense of accumulated weight, of things that happened there that have not yet finished maturing. Okafor, who had been posted to the East Corridor for longer than I had, told me once, in the brief transition conversation you have when one person relieves another, which is usually strictly functional, that he'd started timing his breathing differently in that corridor. How do you mean? I said. He thought about it for a second. Slower, he said. Like there's no point rushing it. He said it the way you say something you've thought about more than you'll admit, in the voice reserved for things you won't say twice. I wrote it down that night. Okafor, slower. Like there's no point rushing it. The incident happened on my 9th rotation. I want to be precise about this because it matters. It mattered then in the immediate adrenaline and protocol sense, and it has mattered since in the other sense, the one I keep returning to in the notebook. It was a Thursday, which meant Mr. Cavendish's window, though he hadn't come through yet. The morning tours had cleared by 11. The corridor was in one of its long gaps. I had grown to expect them, had stopped finding them oppressive, had begun to understand that they were the corridor's natural state, and the tours were the interruption, not the other way around. At 11:34, a woman came into the corridor from the far end. Not a tour, not authorized. I knew this immediately because authorized individuals in that wing move with a particular quality of purposeful ease that you learn to recognize. She moved with the energy of someone who had gotten further than they intended to and was now past the point where turning back felt possible. Tourists who drift out of their group zone do this. The building is large and complex, and the signage, for understandable reasons, doesn't fully explain what's restricted and what isn't, and occasionally someone ends up somewhere they shouldn't be wearing the expression of someone who has accidentally opened the wrong door to party. She was in her 30s. Dark coat, a scarf she'd pushed to one side. She'd been outside recently, hadn't had time to rearrange it properly. She had a camera bag on one shoulder, the kind that serious amateur photographers carry, but don't always use, and she was looking at the ceiling in the way that betrays genuine interest rather than tourist performance. She reached the midpoint of the corridor before she registered me. When she did, she stopped. The automatic social recalibration, the recognition of uniform, of official presence, of having been caught somewhere borderline, was visible in her face in approximately the same way it's visible in everyone's face, which is a particular tightening around the eyes and a preparatory micro-adjustment of the mouth. Then, she looked at the door, and she didn't move. I have seen several hundred people look at that door. Patricia's tour groups, the liaisons, and administrators, and officials who pass through on business. The maintenance staff who move through with the brisk practiced efficiency of people who are paid to be adjacent to significance without being distracted by it. I have watched all of them look at the door. She looked at it differently. The way she looked at it, I had no procedure for. There is protocol for unauthorized visitors, clear, polite redirection, confirmation of their route to the nearest public area, documentation, if required. There's no protocol for unauthorized visitors who look at the throne room door with an expression that is not tourist wonder, not reverence, not the usual matrix of things people display near places that matter. She looked at it the way you look at something that has said your name in a crowd, the way you look at something when you think you might have heard it, but you're not sure and you're waiting for it to happen again. I said, "Excuse me, ma'am." Standard tone, standard volume. She came back from wherever she'd gone. Slowly, the way people come back from somewhere they were pulled into, without quite choosing it. "Sorry," she said. Sorry. I came with the 10 o'clock tour, and I went the wrong way." "Not a problem," I said. "If you head back to the end of the corridor and take the left, can I ask you something?" The correct answer, officially, is no. Not because guards are forbidden from speaking. We're permitted limited interaction with the public. But because inviting conversation on posting is a category of distraction that the training is fairly explicit about. I don't know why I said yes. I said yes. "Does it always feel like this?" she asked. She wasn't looking at me when she said it. She was looking at the door again, and her voice had the quality of someone asking a question they've been carrying for a while, not the quality of someone generating a question on the spot. "Like what, ma'am?" She thought about it, which I respected. The thinking, the not reaching for the first word. "Like the seconds in here weigh something," she said. "Like they're heavier here than everywhere else." I looked at the door. I thought about my notebook. I thought about Mr. Cavendish and his 17 feet and his recalibrating arithmetic expression. I thought about Okafor, slower, like there's no point rushing it, and about the specific quality of old cold. I thought about the fact that this woman had walked into this corridor by accident, and within 90 seconds had found the exact language I'd spent 9 rotations looking for. I said, "You should head back to the public area, ma'am. Left at the end, then follow the signs." She held the door with her eyes for one more second. Then she nodded and adjusted her camera bag and walked back the way she'd come. At the end of the corridor, she turned left without looking back. I stood in the silence. She left. Check my watch. 11:42. Mr. Cavendish arrived at 11:51 and stood at his 17-foot mark for 93 seconds and left. The afternoon tour came through at 1400 hours. Patricia with 17 people this time. Encyclopedia voice, half-beat pause at the door. At 1600 hours, Okafor relieved me. Anything to report? Unauthorized visitor, 1134, I said. Redirected to public area. No incident. Good, he said, and took his post. I walked down the corridor. At the far end, before I turned the corner, I paused. I don't know what I was doing, giving myself something to write down, maybe trying to feel it from a distance. Now that the posting was over, like pressing a bruise to confirm it's real. The corridor sat in its particular heavy silence. The door held what it held. I wrote in the notebook that night, "The seconds in here weigh something." She said it in 5 words. I've been here 9 rotations trying to say it. She walked in by accident and said it in 5 words. I think the corridor chooses who hears it. I told my father about it once. I didn't mean to. It came out the way things come out when you've been carrying them too long, and the weight redistributes unexpectedly, mid-conversation, mid-cup of tea, in his kitchen on a Sunday, with football on in the background, and neither of us really watching it. He'd asked how the job was in the way he always asked, which was the way of a man who was proud but didn't have the vocabulary for the specific pride, and so asked general questions and hoped the answers would fill in the gaps. It's fine, I said. There's this one posting. He waited. My father is good at waiting. Delivery vans train you to be patient in a way that nothing else quite does. I think the specific patience of someone who is always at the mercy of traffic and loading bays and other people's schedules. There's a corridor, I said, near the throne room, and I keep noticing I stopped. Tried again. It feels different there. Different how? Heavier, I said. Time feels heavier. He was quiet for a moment. On the television, someone did something impressive with a ball, and the commentator said something impressed about it. That makes sense, my father said. I looked at him. Of course it does, he said. You're standing next to the room where they crown kings. What do you expect it to feel like? I thought about that for a long time on the drive home. Not the content of it, the simplicity of it. He had arrived at the point in approximately 9 seconds that I had been circling for months. He hadn't needed the notebook. He hadn't needed the observations about Old Cold and the 11-second silence differential and Okafor's breathing and the woman with the camera bag. He had needed approximately one piece of information. You're standing next to the room where they crown kings. My father, who drove a delivery van and left university out of the question by necessity, and watched football on Sundays, and had never in his life stood in a royal palace, had understood it immediately and completely. I drove home thinking about what that meant, about the kinds of understanding that don't require proximity, about whether I was perhaps the least qualified person to understand the thing I was standing next to, too close, too inside it, too busy counting seconds and cataloging the specific qualities of silence to simply feel the weight for what it was. The 12th rotation. By the 12th, I developed what I can only describe as a relationship with the posting. Not comfort, exactly, but something like the absence of resistance. The way you stop bracing for cold water after you've been it long enough. You don't stop feeling it. You just stop spending energy fighting the fact of it. I stood. I breathed. I watched the door. The morning gaps had become something I looked forward to in a qualified way. The way you look forward to something that is difficult but clarifying. 40 minutes of that particular wait, that particular silence. And you come out the other side knowing something you didn't know before, though the thing you know is never quite articulable. It lives below the line where language reaches. Mr. Cavendish came through at 11:47. He stood at 17 feet for 88 seconds, the shortest duration I'd recorded. He looked older than the first time I'd seen him, which might have been true or might have been the corridor's effect. Or both. The two things were not, I had decided, mutually exclusive. As he turned to leave, he did something he hadn't done on any previous visit. He looked at me. Not the studied non-look that authorized people use to navigate past guard posts. The deliberate absence of eye contact that is itself a form of acknowledgement, the social shorthand that says, I see that you are here, and I'm choosing not to engage with you because we both understand the protocol. He looked at me the way people look at each other when they want to know if the other person is also feeling the thing that they are feeling. The checking look. Am I alone in this look? I on my post. Chin at the correct angle. Eyes at the correct mid-distance point. But I gave him something. I couldn't have explained what it was, and I could not have documented it in a report. A fractional adjustment of something in my expression, not a nod, not recognition in any actionable sense. More like an acknowledgement that an acknowledgement had been received. He held it for a second. Then he walked away. I thought about that look for the rest of the shift. Thought about it in the same way I thought about the woman with the camera bag. The quality of the thing shared, the currency of it. The fact that the corridor seemed to produce this. This specific kind of recognition between people who had no other context for each other, no common ground except the common ground of having stood in that particular gravitational field and felt it pull. We were not friends. We did not have a relationship. He was a parliamentary liaison in a well-made suit, and I was a guard in a bearskin, and the gap between those categories in that building was structural and unambiguous. But we had stood at the same distance from the same door and felt the same thing, differently shaped by our different lives and what those lives had built in us, but fundamentally the same, and that created something. A thread, the thinnest possible thread. I wrote in the notebook that night, the room doesn't care who you are. That might be the most democratic thing about it. It applies the same weight to everyone. My final posting to the East Corridor was in early December. Unplanned. Okafor had a family emergency. I found out later, not from him, that it was his mother, that she'd been in hospital, that it resolved well, and I was called in to cover the morning shift with about 40 minutes notice. No time to prepare, no time to think about it. I was given my assignment at the gate and walked to my post, and that was that. December morning in the East Corridor. The light comes in differently in winter. The windows at the far end angle it lower. So by mid-morning you get this particular quality of gray gold that fills the corridor without illuminating anything specifically, without landing on any single surface with confidence. Everything is ambient. Everything is equally lit and equally unlit. I arrived at 7:48. Took my post. The first thing I noticed was that it was completely quiet. Not the usual quality of quiet. Not that dense specific silence I'd cataloged across 11 previous rotations. Genuinely quiet. Emptily quiet. The way a room sounds when something that is usually present in it has been removed. The throne room door was unchanged. Same door. Same brass. Same closed. But, and I'm going to write this down the way I wrote it in the notebook later, without adjusting it to sound more defensible, because the defensible version would be less accurate. The weight was different. Not absent. Not gone. The corridor still had its character, its accumulated material. Centuries don't vacate on a Thursday because Okafor's mother needed him. But there was something else layered into it. Something recent. The way a room that has been the site of an important conversation still holds the conversation in its air for a little while afterward, even after the people have left. Something had happened in that room. Recently. Very recently. I had no information to support this. Nothing on the news that morning. No unusual protocols. No change in the building's operational tempo that I'd been briefed about. Nothing official. Just the corridor and the door and the quality of the air and that particular listening for something alertness that I'd first felt on my third rotation and had never entirely stopped feeling. At 9:23, Patricia brought her tour through. 13 people. Patricia's half-beat pause at the door was longer. Not by much. A fraction of a second. Anyone who hadn't spent 12 rotations measuring the silence in that corridor would not have noticed it. But I noticed it. And in that fraction of a second, Patricia's encyclopedia voice dropped. Not a word, not even half a word, but in the way a clock pauses between the tick and the tock when it needs to recalibrate. And in that gap, I understood that she felt it too. Whatever it was, whatever had changed or been decided or been carried across that threshold. She resumed. Move her group along. Nobody in the tour would have caught the pause. It was the smallest possible thing, but it was real. After the morning tours cleared, there was a gap of nearly an hour. I stood in it. I thought a lot about what those hours add up to. 12 rotations, 4-hour minimum, often longer, call it 60 hours, maybe 70, standing in that corridor over the course of a year. 60 hours of listening to a silence I couldn't name, watching a door that didn't open, accumulating observations I had nowhere to put except a 90-pence notebook. What did I learn? Here's what I can say, as precisely as I am capable of saying it. There are places in the world where time behaves differently. Not in any mystical sense. I'm not making a mystical claim. In a material sense. Places where the weight of what has happened is physically present in the way gravity is physically present. Not visible, not provable by looking at it, but experienced by every body that enters the field. The throne room corridor is one of those places. Standing in it for long enough changes something in the relationship you have with your own temporary existence. Not dramatically, not in any way you could report to Holloway or describe in a debrief, but quietly, in a way that deep cold works into your bones. You carry a small amount of it out with you every time. You spend 60 hours standing next to the room where they crown kings, and some cellular part of you begins to understand, not intellectually, but physically, that you are one link in a chain that extends in both directions for a very long time, and that the chain does not particularly require your individual understanding to continue operating. This sounds like it should be depressing. It isn't. That's the thing that surprised me most. It is, if anything, a relief. At 1400 hours, the afternoon tour. Patricia with 11 people. At 14:33, Mr. Cavendish. He came through and stopped at his mark and looked at the door. But today, this Friday in December, in the lower angled winter light, he didn't stand for 90 seconds or 88 or 2 minutes. He stood for 6. I know because I counted. I can count without it being visible, without it disturbing my post or my expression. I counted. 6 minutes. He stood at 17 feet from the throne room door for 6 unbroken minutes, and he looked at the door with that arithmetic expression, except today the arithmetic had arrived somewhere. Today the expression was the expression of someone who has completed a calculation, and the answer has landed, and they're deciding what to do with it. At the end of 6 minutes, he did something else he'd never done before. He stepped forward, not to the door, not enough to reach it, but enough, a few feet, moving him from 17 feet to maybe 11, to stand in the gravitational pull of it at closer range. And then he stood there at 11 feet, and the thing I've been watching happen to his posture across a year of Thursday visits happened completely. Whatever he carried walked off his shoulders and let itself be held by the corridor instead. And he stood there, an older man in a well-made suit, just standing, not doing anything, just being there with the weight of it, the way the weight required. After a while, he stepped back to his usual mark. The weight returned to its usual resting place on him. He turned, without looking at me, and walked back down the corridor and around the corner and was gone. I looked at the door. 1600 hours. Okafor arrived, back from his mother's recovery, looking like a man who had spent a week sleeping in uncomfortable chairs, which he had, and took his post. Anything to report? The usual protocol. The clean slate each shift begins with. Mr. Cavendish came through, I said. Longer than usual. Okafor looked at the door. Yeah, he said. It's that kind of week. He said it like he knew exactly what kind of week it was. Like the corridor had already told him, in its own way. I walked out. At the far end of the corridor, before the corner, I stopped one more time. Habit by now. The looking back habit. I don't know when it started or whether I'll ever stop doing it. The corridor sat in its silence. The door held everything it had ever held. And I thought about my father in his kitchen on that Sunday. You're standing next to the room where they crown kings, what you expect it to feel like. And I thought about the woman and her camera bag and her 5 words, and I thought about Mr. Cavendish standing 11 feet with his arithmetic finally resolved, and about Okafor breathing slower because there's no point rushing it. I thought about all the people who had stood exactly where I was standing over all the decades and centuries that corridor had existed, and had looked back at the same door and felt the same press of something they couldn't name, but couldn't dismiss. We didn't know each other. We were separated by years and rank and class and century, but we had all been standing in the same gravitational field, pulled toward the same heavy door, trying to find the words for a thing that lives below where words reach. That's the job, maybe. Not the standing, not the protocol, not even the service in the official sense. Just the standing still long enough for the weight to teach you something. Just that. I still have a notebook. Black cover, 90 pence. About 2/3 full now. I haven't posted to the East Corridor in 7 months. Assignments rotate, and the building is large, and there are many corridors, and most of them are ordinary. I miss it in the way you miss a difficult thing that clarified you. I don't know what to do with the notebook. I've thought about leaving it in a drawer somewhere and not looking at it. I've thought about burning it, which is the kind of thought that tells you a thing matters more than you're ready to admit. I've thought about giving it to someone, to Okafor, maybe, or to the woman with the camera bag if I ever saw her again, which I won't. I'll probably just keep it. The last entry, written the night of December's final posting, says, "The room doesn't crown you." It never crowned anyone who wasn't already standing. What it does is show you how long you've been standing and how much standing is still required, and ask you, quietly with the full weight of everything that happened inside it, whether you're prepared to keep going. Every person who has ever walked this corridor has been asked the same question. Most of us say yes. We don't know why, but we say yes.